Jake pressed his eye to the gap in the barn boards and saw 8 skeletal foals locked in darkness, the smallest one barely breathing in the corner. The investigation that followed would expose a man the entire county had trusted for 50 years as the monster hiding in plain sight. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning Jake Hollister found those 8 foals locked in that barn, the sky hung low over Cedar Creek County like a gray wool blanket, pressing down on the rolling hills and open pastures that had defined his life for 47 years. He had been riding the fence line on the old Peterson property, checking for damage after the spring storms, when something made him pull his horse to a stop near the abandoned-looking structure at the edge of the acreage. Maybe it was instinct, that sixth sense developed over decades of working with animals, or maybe it was the faint sound that carried on the wind, something between a whimper and a plea that no creature should ever have to make. Jake Hollister was not a man given to curiosity about other people's business. In a county where neighbors respected boundaries and kept their observations to themselves, he had built a reputation as someone who worked hard, spoke little, and never caused trouble. His weathered face told the story of countless hours under the unforgiving Texas sun, and his calloused hands bore witness to a lifetime of honest labor. At 47, he still rose before dawn, still put in 12-hour days on his modest ranch, and still believed in the simple code that had guided his father and grandfather before him. Take care of your land, take care of your animals, and mind your own affairs. But that morning, something pulled him toward that barn in a way he could not explain. The property belonged to Victor Thornton, a man who had moved to Cedar Creek County about 3 years ago with more money than sense, and a reputation that preceded him from somewhere out east. Thornton had purchased the old Miller spread, nearly 800 acres of prime pasture land that had been in the Miller family for 4 generations before the last of them passed without heirs. The locals had watched with growing suspicion as Thornton transformed the working ranch into what he called a breeding operation, though few had ever seen evidence of legitimate livestock business. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post, his worn boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the structure. The barn had seen better days, its red paint peeling in long strips that hung like wounded skin, the wood beneath gray and weathered from years of neglect. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the doorframe, and the overall appearance suggested abandonment rather than active use. But Jake knew better. He could smell them now, the unmistakable scent of horses, though underneath it lay something else, something that made his stomach turn with a mixture of anger and dread. The barn door was secured with a heavy chain and padlock, rusted but functional. Jake pressed his eye to a gap between the warped boards, and what he saw in the dim interior made his blood run cold. 8 foals, maybe 9, he could not be certain in the darkness, stood in conditions no living creature should endure. They were thin, their ribs visible even in the low light, their coats dull and matted with filth. The smallest one, a little bay with a white blaze on her forehead, lay on her side in the corner, too weak to stand. In 47 years of working with horses, Jake had seen his share of hardship. He had witnessed the aftermath of droughts that withered pastures to dust, had helped neighbors through the heartbreak of losing stock to disease or accident, had even put down animals too injured to save. But he had never, in all his years, seen anything like deliberate cruelty on this scale. These were not animals fallen on hard times through circumstances beyond their owner's control. These were babies, innocent creatures barely weaned from their mothers, locked away and left to suffer by someone who should have been caring for them. Jake stepped back from the barn, his hands trembling with a rage he struggled to contain. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to break down that door, to get those foals out of there immediately, to do something, anything to end their suffering. But he was also a man who understood the law, who knew that trespassing and destruction of property, however justified it might feel, could compromise any case against whoever was responsible for this horror. He needed to do this right. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, grateful for once that his daughter had insisted he finally get one of those smartphones everyone seemed to carry these days. His fingers felt thick and clumsy as he dialed the number for the Cedar Creek County Sheriff's Department, a number he had never had cause to use in all his years as a resident. The dispatcher who answered sounded young, bored, probably expecting another complaint about speeding on the county roads or a noise disturbance from one of the newer subdivisions creeping into their rural community. "This is Jake Hollister," he said, his voice rougher than usual with suppressed emotion. "I'm out on the old Miller place, the property Victor Thornton bought a few years back. There's a barn here on the north section, and I need someone to come out right away. I found something bad." The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately, the professional training kicking in. "Can you describe what you found, Mr. Hollister?" Jake looked back at the barn, at the peeling paint and the heavy chain securing the door, and he thought about those 8 foals inside, about the smallest one lying in the corner too weak to lift her head. "Horses," he said. "Foals. 8 of them, locked in there and starving. One of them, I don't know if she'll make it through the day." The response was swift. Within 20 minutes, Jake saw the dust plume of approaching vehicles coming up the long dirt road that led to this remote corner of the Thornton property. 2 Sheriff's Department cruisers arrived first, followed by a truck he recognized as belonging to Dr. Sarah Chen, the county veterinarian who had been treating livestock in Cedar Creek for the past 15 years. Behind them came another vehicle, a sedan that Jake did not recognize but would later learn belonged to a representative from the state's Animal Welfare Division. Deputy Marcus Webb was the first to reach him, a man Jake knew slightly from church and community events. Webb was young, maybe 30, but carried himself with the steady competence of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Mr. Hollister," he said, extending his hand, "you want to show us what you found?" Jake led them to the barn, pointing out the gap in the boards where he had first glimpsed the foals inside. Dr. Chen pressed her face to the opening, and Jake watched her expression transform from professional concern to something approaching horror. "We need to get in there now," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "I can see at least 2 that need immediate attention." What followed was a careful ballet of legal procedure and desperate compassion. Deputy Webb photographed the exterior of the barn, documenting the chains, the locks, the overall condition of the structure. Another deputy called for backup and began the process of contacting Victor Thornton to request access to the property. But when Dr. Chen declared a veterinary emergency, citing imminent risk of death to multiple animals, Webb made the decision to cut the chain. The smell that escaped when the barn doors swung open was something Jake knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Ammonia and decay, fear and suffering, all of it concentrated in that dark space where 8 innocent creatures had been left to waste away. The foals shied back from the sudden light, their eyes wide with terror, unable to distinguish between the humans who had caused their suffering and those who had come to end it. Dr. Sarah Chen moved into the barn with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent her career dealing with agricultural emergencies, but even her professional composure wavered as she assessed the scene before her. The 8 foals were in varying stages of malnutrition and dehydration, their bodies bearing witness to weeks, perhaps months, of systematic neglect. The smallest one, the bay filly Jake had spotted lying in the corner, was barely breathing, her flanks rising and falling in shallow, labored movements that spoke of a body beginning to surrender. "I need blankets, water, and my emergency kit from the truck," Dr. Chen called out, her voice cutting through the shocked silence that had fallen over the assembled group. "And someone needs to call the equine hospital in Millbrook. We're going to need transport for at least 3 of these animals within the hour." Jake found himself moving before he consciously decided to help, his decades of experience with horses taking over where words failed him. He retrieved the supplies Dr. Chen requested, then knelt beside the weakest foal, speaking to her in the low, soothing tones that had calmed countless frightened animals over the years. The filly's eyes rolled toward him, and in their dark depths he saw something that broke his heart, a flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, as if she wanted to believe that help had finally come but could not quite trust that it was real. "Easy now, little one," Jake murmured, his weathered hand gentle against her matted coat. "We've got you. You're going to be okay." He did not know if that was true. Looking at her, at the way her bones pressed against her skin like accusations, he was not certain she would survive the next few hours. But he said the words anyway, because she needed to hear them. Because hope was sometimes the only medicine that mattered. The other foals watched from the shadows of the barn, huddled together in a group that spoke of the bonds they had formed in their shared suffering. There were 3 more fillies and 4 colts, ranging in age from perhaps 4 months to nearly a year old. They were all thin, all frightened, all bearing the marks of neglect that no amount of future care could entirely erase. But they were alive, and as Jake looked at them, he felt something harden in his chest, a determination that whoever was responsible for this would face the full consequences of their cruelty. Deputy Webb approached him as Dr. Chen worked on the sickest foal, starting an IV line with hands that remained steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Mr. Hollister, I need to ask you some questions about how you came to find this barn, just for the record." Jake nodded, rising slowly from his position beside the filly. His knees protested the movement, reminding him that he was not as young as he used to be, but he ignored the discomfort. There were more important things to focus on than his own aches and pains. "I was riding the fence line on my property," he explained, gesturing toward the east where his own land bordered the Thornton acreage. "We had those storms last week, and I wanted to check for damage. This barn sits pretty close to the property line, and I heard something as I was passing. Thought it might be a coyote at first, or maybe a herd animal that had wandered in. When I got closer, I could smell them." Webb wrote in his notebook, his pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. "Had you ever noticed anything unusual about this property before? Any signs of animals being kept here?" Jake considered the question carefully. In truth, he had wondered about Victor Thornton's operation for some time. The man claimed to be running a breeding program for high-end sport horses, but Jake had rarely seen evidence of proper horse husbandry on the property. The pastures were often empty, the barns closed up tight, and Thornton himself seemed more interested in his trips to the city than in the daily work of caring for livestock. "I've had my suspicions," Jake admitted. "Nothing I could put my finger on, just a feeling that something wasn't right over here. Thornton's not a horseman. You can tell by the way he handles them, the few times I've seen him with an animal. He looks at them like they're inventory, not living creatures." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Jake turned to see a large horse trailer coming up the road, the Millbrook Equine Hospital logo visible on its side. Behind it came another sheriff's cruiser and a dark SUV with government plates. The cavalry had arrived, and with it, the full weight of official attention that Victor Thornton had apparently been avoiding for too long. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The 3 sickest foals, including the little bay filly Jake had found lying in the corner, were loaded carefully into the trailer and transported to the hospital in Millbrook, where a team of veterinary specialists waited to begin the intensive care they would need. The remaining 5 were moved to a temporary holding facility that the county maintained for situations exactly like this one, where they would receive proper nutrition, veterinary attention, and the beginnings of rehabilitation. Jake stayed through all of it, unable to bring himself to leave until he knew the foals were safe. He helped load the animals, held them steady when they trembled with fear, and spoke to them in the same calm voice he used with his own horses back home. By the time the last trailer pulled away, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty after the ugliness of what the day had revealed. "Mr. Hollister." Deputy Webb approached him again, his expression grave. "I wanted to let you know that we've been trying to reach Victor Thornton all afternoon. He's not answering his phone, and his housekeeper says he left for Houston yesterday morning and hasn't been back." "Running," Jake said flatly. It was not a question. Maybe. Or maybe he just doesn't know we're looking for him yet. Either way, we've put out a bulletin. State police are watching the airports and the bus stations. If he tries to leave Texas, we'll know about it. Jake nodded, but he felt no satisfaction in the news. Catching Thornton would be justice, but it would not undo the suffering those 8 foals had endured. It would not give back the weeks or months they had spent locked in that dark barn, hungry and afraid. Some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we build a case," Webb replied, "and we find out exactly what Victor Thornton has been doing on this property." The investigation into Victor Thornton's operation revealed a web of deception that extended far beyond what anyone in Cedar Creek County had imagined. Over the following days, as Jake tried to return to the normal rhythms of his own ranch work, he found himself drawn back to the unfolding story, checking in with Deputy Webb, visiting the Foals at the temporary holding facility, and piecing together the fragments of information that emerged from the official inquiry. Victor Thornton, it turned out, was not the successful businessman he had presented himself to be when he arrived in Cedar Creek County 3 years earlier. The wealth that had allowed him to purchase the old Miller spread had come from a series of insurance fraud schemes in 3 different states, schemes that investigators were only now beginning to unravel. The horse breeding operation had been nothing more than a front, a way to launder money and create the appearance of legitimate business activity while Thornton continued his criminal enterprises. The foals Jake had found were the victims of one such scheme. Thornton had purchased them cheaply from various auctions and private sellers across the region, falsified their registration papers to inflate their apparent value, and then insured them for amounts far exceeding what he had paid. The plan, investigators believed, had been to collect insurance money when the horses inevitably died from the neglect he subjected them to, claiming illness or accident as the cause. He was killing them slowly, Dr. Chen explained to Jake when he stopped by her office to check on the foals' progress. The starvation, the dehydration, the lack of veterinary care, it was all designed to look like natural causes, like some disease had swept through his herd. He probably would have gotten away with it if you hadn't found that barn when you did. The thought made Jake sick to his stomach. He had lived his entire life by a simple code of honor, treating his animals with the respect and care they deserved, working the land the way his father and grandfather had taught him. The idea that someone could view living creatures as nothing more than props in a financial scheme, as objects to be used and discarded without conscience, was incomprehensible to him. "How are they doing?" he asked, steering the conversation toward something he could actually influence. "The little bay filly, the one that was lying down when we found them. Did she make it?" Dr. Chen's expression softened. "She's still at Millbrook, still in intensive care, but she's fighting. They've got her on IV fluids and nutritional support, and she's starting to show some improvement. It's going to be a long road, but the specialists think she has a chance." Jake nodded, feeling a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. He had not been able to stop thinking about that filly, about the way she had looked at him with those dark, trusting eyes when he knelt beside her in the barn. He did not know why her survival mattered so much to him, except that it did, that somehow her fate had become intertwined with his own need to believe that good could still triumph over cruelty in this world. "The others are doing better," Dr. Chen continued. "The 5 at the holding facility are already gaining weight, starting to show some spirit. Young horses are resilient. Given proper care and time, most of them should make full recoveries. And then what happens to them? That depends on the legal proceedings. Right now, they're technically still Thornton's property, even though he's facing criminal charges. Once he's convicted, or if he surrenders ownership as part of a plea deal, they'll become wards of the state. After that, they could be adopted out to qualified homes or placed with rescue organizations. Jake left Dr. Chen's office with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of purpose that he had not felt in years. His own life had fallen into a comfortable routine after his wife passed away 5 years ago, his days filled with the necessary work of maintaining his ranch, but empty of the deeper meaning that had once driven him. Finding those foals, becoming involved in their rescue, had awakened something in him that he thought had died along with Martha. The town of Cedar Creek was buzzing with news of the case. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the revelation that Victor Thornton had been running a criminal operation right under their noses was the biggest scandal anyone could remember. Opinions were divided, as they always were in small towns, between those who claimed they had always suspected something was wrong with that outsider and those who felt guilty for not paying closer attention to what was happening on the Thornton property. Jake avoided most of the gossip, preferring to focus on the practical matters at hand. He visited the holding facility every day, spending time with the 5 foals who were recovering there, helping the staff with feeding and basic care. The young horses were beginning to trust humans again, a slow process that required patience and consistency, but one that Jake found deeply satisfying. It was during one of these visits, about a week after the initial discovery, that Deputy Webb found him in the paddock, brushing the coat of a young colt who had finally stopped flinching at human touch. "Thought I'd find you here," Webb said, leaning against the fence rail. "I've got news." Jake set down the brush and gave the deputy his full attention. "You found Thornton?" "Better than that. We arrested him this morning at a motel outside of San Antonio. He was trying to arrange transport to Mexico, had a bag full of cash and a fake passport. But that's not the news I came to share." Jake waited, sensing that whatever Webb was about to tell him was significant. "When we searched his property more thoroughly, we found records, financial documents, correspondence, evidence of his entire operation going back years. And we found something else, something that connects Thornton to people here in Cedar Creek. People nobody would have suspected." The deputy's expression was grim, his eyes holding a weight that spoke of betrayals discovered and illusions shattered. "Jake, Victor Thornton didn't come to Cedar Creek by accident. He was invited here, set up in business here, by someone who's been part of this community for decades, someone everyone trusts." The name hit Jake like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and leaving him momentarily unable to speak. Harold Winters, the man who had been Cedar Creek County's most respected citizen for as long as anyone could remember, the owner of the largest feed and supply store in 3 counties, the deacon at First Baptist Church, the chairman of the county fair committee, and the person everyone turned to when they needed advice or assistance. Harold Winters, who had been a pallbearer at Jake's wife Martha's funeral, who had brought casseroles and condolences during those dark first weeks of grief, who had checked in on Jake regularly during that terrible first year of widowhood. "You're certain?" Jake finally managed, his voice rough with disbelief. "Harold Winters." Deputy Webb nodded, his expression reflecting the same shock that Jake felt. "The documents don't lie. Winters has been laundering money through his business for years, using the feed store as a front for moving cash from Thornton's insurance schemes. He's the one who found the Miller property for Thornton, who introduced him around town, who vouched for him when people started asking questions about the new neighbor who never seemed to actually work his ranch." Jake leaned against the fence, suddenly feeling every one of his 47 years. Harold Winters was 72 years old, a pillar of the community who had built his reputation over 5 decades of what everyone believed was honest dealing and Christian charity. The betrayal was almost too enormous to comprehend. "Does Harold know you found the connection?" "Not yet. We're building the case carefully, making sure we have everything we need before we move. The district attorney wants this airtight. Harold Winters has a lot of friends in this county, including some in positions of authority. We can't afford to give his lawyers any room to maneuver. Jake thought about all the times he had done business with Harold, all the conversations they had shared over the years about cattle prices and weather patterns and the changing nature of rural life. He thought about the way Harold had clapped him on the shoulder at Martha's funeral, had told him that time would heal the wound, even though it never really did. Had all of it been a performance? Had Harold been calculating and scheming even while offering comfort to a grieving widower? Why? Jake asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Harold's got more money than he could ever spend. His business is successful. His family is comfortable. Why would he risk everything to help someone like Thornton? Webb shook his head slowly. That's what we're trying to figure out. The financial records show payments going back at least 10 years, long before Thornton ever showed up in Cedar Creek. Whatever their arrangement is, it started somewhere else, with something else. We're working with investigators in other states to piece together the full picture. The deputy left Jake alone with the Foals and his troubled thoughts. The young colt he had been grooming nudged his shoulder, seeking the attention that had been interrupted, and Jake automatically resumed brushing, finding comfort in the familiar motion, even as his mind churned with the implications of what he had learned. Harold Winters had been a friend of Jake's father, had known Jake since he was a boy learning to ride on his family's ranch. The man had been present at every significant moment in Jake's life, from his high school graduation to his wedding to the births of his 2 children. The idea that this person, this fixture of Jake's existence, had been living a double life all along, made Jake question everything he thought he knew about his community and the people in it. The days that followed were tense with anticipation. Jake went about his regular work, tending to his cattle and maintaining his property, but his mind was never far from the investigation unfolding around him. He continued visiting the Foals at the holding facility, finding in their gradual recovery a counterweight to the darkness that seemed to be spreading through Cedar Creek. The little bay filly at Millbrook was improving steadily, according to the updates Dr. Chen provided. She had been named Hope by the hospital staff, a name that Jake thought suited her perfectly. Against all odds, she was fighting her way back to health, gaining weight and strength with each passing day. The specialists were cautiously optimistic that she would make a full recovery, though they warned that the psychological scars of her ordeal might take longer to heal than the physical ones. Jake found himself thinking about Hope often, about the resilience she represented, about the capacity of living things to survive even the most terrible circumstances. He had seen that resilience in horses before, in the way they could endure hardship and still respond to kindness, still learn to trust again after being given every reason not to. It was one of the things he loved most about working with animals, that reminder that healing was always possible, even when the damage seemed insurmountable. 2 weeks after Thornton's arrest, the other shoe finally dropped. Jake was in town picking up supplies when he saw the sheriff's vehicles parked outside the Winters Feed and Supply, their lights flashing in the early morning sun. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, watching as deputies emerged from the store with boxes of documents and evidence bags filled with materials Jake could not identify from his position across the street. And then Harold Winters himself appeared, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face pale and drawn, as Deputy Webb guided him toward a waiting cruiser. The old man looked up as he was being loaded into the back seat, and for a moment his eyes met Jake's across the distance. In that brief connection, Jake saw something he had not expected. Not guilt, not shame, but a strange kind of resignation, as if Harold had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The arrest of Harold Winters sent shockwaves through Cedar Creek County that would take years to fully subside. But for Jake, Standing on that sidewalk, watching a man he had trusted being taken away in handcuffs, it was only the beginning of a journey that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The aftermath of Harold Winter's arrest tore through Cedar Creek County like a wildfire through dry brush, leaving scorched earth and shattered illusions in its wake. Families who had trusted the old man for generations found themselves questioning every interaction, every transaction, every piece of advice he had ever given them. The feed store closed its doors indefinitely while investigators combed through decades of financial records, and the void it left in the community was both practical and symbolic. Jake watched it all unfold from the periphery, grateful for the distance his ranch provided from the worst of the gossip and recrimination. He had his own reckoning to do, his own process of coming to terms with the betrayal, but he preferred to work through it in the quiet company of his animals rather than in the fevered atmosphere of town. Every morning he rose before dawn, completed his chores, and then drove to the holding facility to spend time with the recovering foals. It had become his ritual, his way of reminding himself that something good had come from the ugliness that had been exposed. The 5 foals at the facility were thriving now, their coats beginning to shine with health, their eyes bright with the curiosity and energy that young horses should possess. They had learned to associate humans with food and comfort rather than neglect and fear, and watching their transformation gave Jake a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced in years. He had started working with them individually, beginning the gentle process of halter training and basic groundwork that would prepare them for eventual adoption. "You're good with them," observed Rachel Torres, the young woman who managed the holding facility. She had been watching Jake work with a gray colt, teaching him to yield to pressure on the lead rope without force or fear. "Most people don't have the patience for this kind of work." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. "Just doing what needs to be done. These babies have had a rough start. Least I can do is help them learn that not all humans are like the one who hurt them." Rachel leaned against the fence, her expression thoughtful. "The county's going to start looking for permanent placement soon. The legal stuff with Thornton is moving faster than expected. His lawyer's pushing for a plea deal, which means ownership of the horses will transfer to the state within the next few weeks." "What kind of homes are they looking for?" "Experienced horse people, mostly. Folks who understand what these animals have been through and have the resources to continue their rehabilitation. The rescue organizations have already expressed interest, but the preference is for individual placements where they can get one-on-one attention." Jake nodded slowly, an idea forming in the back of his mind that he was not quite ready to voice. His ranch had the space, the facilities, and certainly he had the experience. But taking on the responsibility of rehabilitating traumatized young horses was not a decision to be made lightly, especially for a man living alone who was not getting any younger. That evening, Jake drove to Millbrook to visit Hope at the equine hospital. The little bay filly had been moved from intensive care to a regular stall, a sign of her remarkable progress, and Jake had been visiting her whenever his schedule allowed. The hospital staff had grown accustomed to seeing him, the quiet cowboy who sat with the foal for hours, talking to her in low tones and helping her relearn trust one gentle interaction at a time. Hope nickered when she saw him approach, a soft sound of recognition that made Jake's heart swell. 3 weeks ago, this same filly had been too weak to lift her head, her body shutting down from starvation and dehydration. Now she stood at the front of her stall, ears pricked forward, waiting for the treats she knew he would bring. "Hey there, little lady," Jake murmured, offering her a piece of carrot from his pocket. "Look at you, getting stronger every day." The filly lipped the treat from his palm, her whiskers tickling his skin in a way that made him smile despite himself. He let himself into the stall and stood beside her, running his hands over her body to check her condition. She was still thin, her ribs visible beneath her coat. But she was gaining weight steadily, and the dull resignation had left her eyes, replaced by the spark of life that every young creature deserved. "Dr. Martinez says she might be ready for discharge in another week or two," said a voice from behind him. Jake turned to find Dr. Chen standing at the stall door, having driven up from Cedar Creek to check on her former patient. "She's exceeded everyone's expectations." "She's a fighter," Jake agreed, returning his attention to the filly. "From the moment I found her, I could see it in her. She wanted to live. The question now is what happens next. She's going to need continued care, specialized attention, someone who can help her work through the trauma she experienced." Dr. Chen paused, her gaze meaningful. "Rachel Torres tells me you've been spending a lot of time with the other foals too." Jake recognized the opening for what it was, an invitation to declare intentions he had not fully admitted to himself. He continued stroking Hope's neck, feeling the warmth of her body beneath his palm, the steady rhythm of her breathing. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "My place has room. I've got the pastures, the barn space, the experience. And these horses, they need someone who understands what they've been through." "All 8 of them?" Jake turned to face Dr. Chen, seeing the surprise in her expression, mixed with something that might have been approval. "All 8 of them," he confirmed. "They came into this world together, suffered together, got rescued together. Seems wrong to split them up now when they're just starting to heal." It was a commitment that would change the entire shape of his life, and Jake knew it. But standing there in that hospital stall with Hope's trusting eyes watching him, and the memory of what he had found in that barn still fresh in his mind, he could not imagine any other choice. The decision to adopt all 8 foals set in motion a series of changes that transformed Jake's quiet existence into something entirely new. His ranch, which had operated at half capacity since Martha's death, suddenly required expansion and renovation to accommodate the incoming horses. The old barn needed repairs, new fencing had to be installed, and the pastures required careful management to ensure adequate grazing for the additional animals. For the first time in years, Jake found himself working with purpose beyond mere maintenance, building something rather than simply preserving what remained. The community's response to his decision surprised him. In the weeks following Harold Winter's arrest, Cedar Creek County had been mired in suspicion and recrimination, neighbors eyeing each other with newfound wariness, wondering who else might be hiding secrets behind a respectable facade. But Jake's commitment to the rescued foals seemed to offer people something they desperately needed: proof that goodness still existed, that compassion could triumph over cruelty, that one person's actions could make a meaningful difference. Volunteers appeared at his ranch without being asked, offering labor and materials to help prepare for the horses' arrival. Tom Blackwood, who ran the hardware store, donated fencing supplies at cost. Mary Sullivan from the diner organized a fundraiser that brought in enough money to cover veterinary expenses for the first 6 months. Even people Jake barely knew stopped him on the street to shake his hand and thank him for what he was doing, as if his kindness somehow redeemed the community's failure to notice what had been happening on the Thornton property. Jake accepted the help with gratitude, though the attention made him uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition for doing what seemed obvious and necessary. Those 8 foals needed a home. He had the means to provide one, and that was the end of his reasoning. The hero worship that some people wanted to bestow upon him felt misplaced and embarrassing. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Victor Thornton, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in prison, accepted a plea deal that included full cooperation with investigators and surrender of all assets, including the horses. Harold Winters proved more difficult, initially maintaining his innocence despite the mountain of documentation connecting him to Thornton's schemes. But as the scope of the investigation expanded, revealing connections to similar operations in 4 other states. Even his expensive lawyers could not construct a viable defense. Jake was called to testify at a preliminary hearing, asked to describe the conditions in which he had found the foals and the circumstances of their discovery. Sitting in that courtroom, facing the man who had been a fixture of his life for as long as he could remember, Jake felt the full weight of the betrayal settle onto his shoulders. Harold Winters looked diminished somehow, smaller than Jake remembered, his expensive suit hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk since his arrest. Their eyes met briefly as Jake took the stand, and in that moment Jake saw something he had not expected. Shame. Not the calculated performance of a man trying to generate sympathy, but genuine shame, the kind that comes from finally seeing yourself clearly after years of self-deception. Harold looked away first, unable to hold Jake's steady gaze, and Jake understood that whatever punishment the legal system imposed, the old man was already living in a prison of his own making. The testimony was straightforward, factual, stripped of the emotion that Jake carried beneath his stoic exterior. He described riding the fence line, hearing the sounds from the barn, discovering the foals in their terrible condition. He identified photographs of the scene, confirmed the timeline of events, answered questions from both prosecution and defense with the same measured calm. When it was over, he walked out of the courthouse without looking back, climbed into his truck, and drove directly to the holding facility to spend time with the horses who had become the center of his new purpose. Hope was discharged from the Millbrook Hospital on a Tuesday morning in late spring, exactly 6 weeks after Jake had found her lying in the corner of that dark barn. He was there to pick her up personally, backing his horse trailer to the loading area with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. The filly who emerged from the hospital was almost unrecognizable as the skeletal creature he had first encountered. Her coat gleamed with health, her eyes were bright and curious, and she moved with the fluid grace that spoke of youth and vitality restored. "She's going to need continued monitoring," Dr. Martinez explained as Jake loaded Hope into the trailer. "Regular weigh-ins, blood work every few months, careful attention to her nutrition. The physical damage is healing, but her immune system was compromised by the malnutrition. She'll be more susceptible to illness than a horse with a normal start in life." Jake nodded, tucking the detailed care instructions into his pocket. "I'll take good care of her, Doc. You have my word." The drive back to Cedar Creek took just over an hour, and Jake spent most of it talking to Hope through the small window that connected the truck cab to the trailer. He told her about the ranch waiting for her, about the other foals who would be joining them soon, about the life they would build together in the aftermath of tragedy. The filly probably understood none of it, but she seemed to find comfort in the sound of his voice, her ears flicking toward him whenever he spoke. When they arrived at the ranch, Jake unloaded Hope into the small paddock he had prepared specifically for her, a space where she could begin acclimating to her new home while remaining close to the barn and the constant attention she still required. She stood for a moment at the fence, surveying her surroundings with an alertness that made Jake smile. Then she dropped her head to the grass, tearing at it with an enthusiasm that spoke of simple pleasures rediscovered, and Jake felt tears prick at his eyes for the first time since Martha's funeral. This was what healing looked like, he realized. Not a dramatic transformation, not a single moment of triumph, but small steps forward, simple joys reclaimed, trust rebuilt one gentle interaction at a time. The remaining 7 foals arrived over the following 2 weeks, transported in small groups to allow each animal adequate attention during the transition. Jake had prepared individual spaces for them, understanding that horses who had endured shared trauma sometimes needed time apart to establish their own sense of security before being reintegrated into a herd. Each arrival brought its own challenges, its own personality, its own particular wounds that required patience and understanding to address. The gray colt Jake had been working with at the holding facility, whom he had named Storm for the way his coat resembled clouds gathering before rain, proved to be the most challenging of the group. Unlike Hope, who had responded to kindness with gradual trust, Storm carried his fear like armor, lashing out at any human who came too close. The trauma had hardened him in ways that would take months, perhaps years, to soften. Jake accepted this reality without frustration, recognizing that healing could not be forced or rushed, only invited and supported. The other foals fell somewhere between Hope's openness and Storm's defensiveness. There was Copper, a chestnut filly with a blaze like a lightning bolt, who startled at sudden movements but calmed quickly when spoken to in gentle tones. There was Shadow, a black colt who preferred to observe from a distance, watching Jake's every move with intelligent eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating. There were the twins, Bonnie and Clyde, as Jake called them, a matched pair of bays who had clearly bonded deeply during their ordeal and refused to be separated even for feeding. There was Dusty, a dun filly with primitive markings on her legs, who had the sweetest temperament of the group and seemed determined to befriend every creature she encountered. And there was Ghost, a pale gray colt so traumatized that he had not made a sound since his rescue, his silence a testament to horrors that Jake could only imagine. Working with 8 young horses simultaneously pushed Jake to his limits. His days began before sunrise, and often did not end until well after dark, filled with feeding schedules and veterinary appointments and the constant patient work of rehabilitation. His body ached in ways it had not since he was a young man breaking horses for other ranchers. And there were moments when he questioned whether he had taken on more than he could handle. But then he would see Hope cantering across her paddock or catch Storm watching him with something other than fear in his eyes, and he would remember why he had made this choice. The community continued to rally around him, offering support in ways both practical and emotional. Rachel Torres from the holding facility drove out twice a week to help with training sessions, her expertise with traumatized animals proving invaluable. Dr. Chen made regular house calls, monitoring the foal's progress and adjusting treatment plans as needed. Even Deputy Webb stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to update Jake on the legal proceedings, but really, Jake suspected, to check on the horses whose rescue had become the defining case of his young career. It was during one of Webb's visits, about a month after the last foal arrived, that Jake learned the full scope of what the investigation had uncovered. They were sitting on Jake's porch watching the horses graze in the evening light, when Webb shared details that had not yet been made public. Thornton wasn't just running insurance fraud, Webb explained, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had discovered. The breeding operation, the neglected horses, that was just one piece of a much larger enterprise. He was connected to a network that stretched across 6 states, moving money through fake livestock operations, real estate schemes, even a few legitimate businesses that served as fronts. Jake absorbed this information in silence, watching Hope move through the pasture with the confidence she had developed over the past weeks. The transformation in her continued to amaze him, from death's door to vibrant health, from terror to trust. "And Harold?" Jake asked finally. How deep was he in it? Webb sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion that Jake recognized. The young deputy had aged visibly since the investigation began, the burden of unraveling his community's secrets taking its toll. Deeper than we initially thought. Winters wasn't just laundering money through the feed store. He was a founding member of the network, one of the original architects of the whole operation. They've been running variations of this scheme for almost 30 years, moving from state to state whenever things got too hot. The revelation should have shocked Jake, but somehow it did not. Once you accepted that someone you trusted had been living a lie, the scope of that lie became almost irrelevant. Whether Harold Winters had stolen thousands or millions, whether he had been involved for years or decades, the fundamental betrayal remained the same. "He's cooperating now," Webb continued. His lawyers finally convinced him that a plea deal was his only option. In exchange for testimony against the others in the network, he'll get a reduced sentence. Probably still spend the rest of his life in prison given his age, but at least he won't die waiting for trial. Jake thought about the man he had known, or thought he had known, for his entire life. The Harold Winters who had taught him to fish in Cedar Creek when Jake was 8 years old. The Harold Winters who had danced with Martha at their wedding, who had held their firstborn child, who had wept at her funeral. Had any of that been real, or had it all been performance, the careful construction of a persona designed to hide the monster underneath? I keep asking myself how I missed it, Jake admitted quietly. All those years, all those conversations. How did I not see what he really was? Webb shook his head slowly. You're not the only one asking that question. Half the county is wondering the same thing. But the truth is, people like Winters are good at hiding. They build their whole lives around the mask. You can't blame yourself for believing what he wanted you to believe. Jake was not sure he agreed, but he appreciated the attempt at comfort. Some lessons he was learning could only be understood through living them. Summer settled over Cedar Creek County like a warm blanket, bringing long days of sunshine that seemed designed to help heal the wounds the community had suffered. The pastures on Jake's ranch turned golden and lush, providing abundant grazing for the 8 foals who were now thriving under his care. What had begun as a rescue operation had transformed into something more profound, a second chance not just for the horses, but for Jake himself, a reason to look forward rather than back. The foals had begun to form a herd, their individual personalities blending into a collective identity that brought Jake unexpected joy to witness. Hope had emerged as the natural leader, her early suffering somehow translating into a quiet confidence that the others seemed to recognize and respect. She was the first to investigate new objects in the pasture, the first to approach Jake when he entered the gate, the first to nicker a greeting when his truck appeared on the ranch road. The bond between them had deepened into something Jake struggled to put into words, a connection forged in the crucible of her near-death and strengthened by every day of recovery that followed. Storm remained the most challenging member of the group, but even he had begun to show signs of progress. The gray colt no longer fled to the far corner of the pasture when Jake approached, instead holding his ground and watching with those wary eyes that missed nothing. Twice now, Storm had allowed Jake to touch his shoulder, brief contacts that lasted only seconds before the colt's nerve broke and he retreated. But those moments represented victories more meaningful than any ribbon Jake had ever won at the county fair, proof that patience and consistency could reach even the most damaged soul. The twins, Bonnie and Clyde, had become inseparable companions to Dusty, the 3 of them forming a smaller unit within the larger herd that played and groomed and grazed together. Ghost, the silent gray colt, had attached himself to Hope, following her everywhere like a shadow seeking light. He still had not vocalized, still carried himself with that haunted quality that spoke of wounds too deep for easy healing, but his eyes had lost some of their emptiness, and occasionally Jake caught him watching the other foals play with something that might have been longing. Copper and Shadow had developed an unlikely friendship, the nervous filly and the watchful colt somehow balancing each other's temperaments. Copper's tendency to startle was tempered by Shadow's calm presence, while Shadow's aloofness softened when Copper sought his company. Jake had learned to read their moods, to understand their silent communications, to anticipate their needs before they became urgent. In caring for them, he had rediscovered parts of himself that he thought had died with Martha. The legal proceedings against Victor Thornton and Harold Winters concluded in late July, both men receiving sentences that would keep them behind bars for the remainder of their natural lives. Jake did not attend the final hearings, choosing instead to spend those days working with his horses, building the future rather than dwelling on the past. He learned of the verdicts from Deputy Webb, who drove out to the ranch specifically to deliver the news in person. "It's over," Webb said, standing beside Jake at the pasture fence as they watched the foals graze in the afternoon sun. Thornton got 45 years, no possibility of parole. Winters got 30, which at his age amounts to the same thing. The network they built is being dismantled piece by piece. Jake nodded slowly, absorbing the information without the satisfaction he might have expected to feel. Justice had been served, but justice could not undo the suffering those men had caused. It could not restore the innocence of the animals they had abused or heal the trust they had betrayed. All it could do was prevent them from causing more harm, and that would have to be enough. "What happens to the Thornton property?" Jake asked. "Bank's taking it back. Apparently Thornton was leveraged to the hilt, borrowed against everything he owned to fund his operations. The whole spread will go to auction once the legal issues are sorted out." Webb paused, giving Jake a meaningful look. "Some folks have been talking about buying it collectively, turning it into some kind of community land trust. Keep it from falling into the wrong hands again." The idea had merit, Jake thought. The old Miller place had been part of Cedar Creek County's heritage for generations before Thornton corrupted it. Returning it to community stewardship would be a fitting end to the ugliness that had unfolded there. "I'd contribute to that," Jake said quietly, "if there's a fund or something being organized." Webb smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him in months. "I figured you might say that. I'll let you know when they get something set up." After Webb left, Jake walked out to the pasture where his horses waited. They gathered around him as they always did now, seeking the treats they knew he carried and the gentle attention he freely gave. Even Storm approached, maintaining his characteristic distance but no longer fleeing at Jake's presence. Progress, small but real, the only kind that truly mattered. Jake found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a man going through the motions of life, maintaining his ranch out of habit rather than passion, counting down the days until he could join Martha in whatever came after. Finding those foals in that barn had changed everything, had given him a reason to engage with the world again, had shown him that purpose could be found in the most unexpected places. He had not saved those horses, he realized. They had saved him. In learning to trust him, they had taught him to trust himself again. In healing under his care, they had healed something broken inside him that he had not even known was damaged. In becoming a herd, they had reminded him that connection was possible, that love did not end with loss, that the heart's capacity for attachment could survive even the deepest grief. Hope nudged his shoulder, demanding attention with the confidence she had developed over weeks of patient rehabilitation. Jake stroked her neck, marveling as he always did at the miracle of her survival, at the spirit that had refused to surrender, even when her body was failing. "We made it, girl," he whispered. "We made it through." Autumn arrived with a spectacular display of color that painted the Texas hills in shades of amber and rust, the landscape transforming as the foals themselves had transformed over the months since their rescue. Jake's ranch had become something of a local attraction, a place where people from across the county came to witness the miracle of 8 young horses who had survived the unthinkable and emerged stronger for it. He welcomed visitors when his schedule allowed, understanding that the community needed to see evidence of healing just as much as the horses needed continued socialization with humans beyond himself. The foals were no longer foals in the technical sense, their bodies maturing into the graceful forms of yearlings with coats that gleamed in the autumn sun. Hope had grown into a stunning mare, her bay coloring deepening to a rich mahogany that turned heads whenever Jake took her into town for veterinary appointments. She had become his constant companion, accompanying him on rides around the property with a steadiness that belied her traumatic beginnings. The bond between them had evolved into something Jake could only describe as partnership, a mutual understanding that transcended the usual relationship between human and horse. Storm's breakthrough came on a cool October morning, unexpected and all the more precious for its surprise. Jake had been working in the barn, mucking stalls with the radio playing softly in the background when he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he found the gray colt standing in the doorway, watching him with those intelligent eyes that had always held such wariness. But something was different this time. A softening in Storm's posture, a lowering of the defenses he had maintained so fiercely. Jake set down his pitchfork and waited, letting Storm make the choice. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Storm stepped forward, one hesitant hoof after another until he stood close enough for Jake to feel the warmth of his breath. The colt extended his muzzle, sniffing Jake's outstretched hand, and then did something he had never done before. He leaned into the touch, pressing his forehead against Jake's palm in a gesture of trust that brought tears to Jake's eyes. "There you go," Jake murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "There you go, boy. I knew you had it in you." The moment passed quickly, Storm's old instincts reasserting themselves as he pulled back and retreated to the safety of distance. But the barrier had been broken, the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. Jake knew from experience that progress was rarely linear, that Storm would likely retreat back into wariness before advancing again. But he also knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the path to healing had finally opened for the most damaged member of his herd. Ghost found his voice on the same day, as if Storm's breakthrough had somehow unlocked something in him as well. Jake heard it from across the pasture, a tentative nicker that stopped him in his tracks. He turned to see the pale gray colt standing beside Hope, his mouth open in a sound so ordinary that its significance might have been lost on anyone who did not know his history. But Jake knew, and the sound of Ghost's voice after months of silence was one of the most beautiful things he had ever heard. The community's response to the horse's progress continued to surprise Jake with its generosity and enthusiasm. The fundraising efforts that had begun in the spring had grown into something more organized, a non-profit foundation dedicated to animal rescue and rehabilitation in Cedar Creek County. Jake had been asked to serve on the board, an honor he accepted with characteristic reluctance but genuine commitment. The foundation's first major project was the acquisition of the old Thornton property, purchased at auction with funds raised from across the region. The plan was to transform the site of such terrible suffering into a sanctuary for rescued animals, a place where creatures like the 8 foals could find safety and healing. Jake had been instrumental in designing the facilities, drawing on his months of experience rehabilitating his own horses to create spaces that prioritized animal welfare above all else. The irony was not lost on him that the very property where he had discovered such horror would become a beacon of hope for animals in need. His children, both grown and living in distant cities, had been watching their father's transformation with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Sarah, his daughter, had flown in for a weekend visit in September, wanting to see the horses she had heard so much about in their phone conversations. She had wept when she met Hope, recognizing in the mare's gentle spirit something that reminded her of her mother. "Mom would have loved this," Sarah said, standing beside Jake at the pasture fence as the horses grazed in the evening light. "She would have loved seeing you like this, Dad. Alive again." Jake had not known how to respond, the truth of her words cutting through the defenses he had built around his grief. Martha had always believed in the healing power of animals, had filled their home with dogs and cats and the occasional orphaned wildlife that needed temporary care. She would have understood what these horses meant to him, would have recognized the gift they had given him in return for his care. "I think about her every day," Jake admitted quietly. "When I'm working with the horses, I can almost feel her watching, like she's proud of what we're building here." Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. "She is, Dad. I know she is." The completion of his transformation from grieving widower to community leader happened so gradually that Jake barely noticed it occurring. People sought his advice on animal matters, consulted him about ranch management, looked to him for guidance on everything from fence repair to feed ratios. He had become, without intending or wanting it, a pillar of Cedar Creek County, his reputation built not on decades of careful performance like Harold Winters, but on simple acts of compassion witnessed and appreciated by his neighbors. The 8 horses who had brought about this change grazed peacefully in their pasture, their bodies strong, their spirits healed, their future secure. They had survived the worst that humanity could inflict, and in surviving, they had shown an entire community what resilience truly meant. 1 year to the day after Jake Hollister found 8 foals locked in that barn, he stood at the entrance to the Cedar Creek Animal Sanctuary, watching as the ribbon-cutting ceremony unfolded before a crowd that had gathered from across the county and beyond. The transformation of the old Thornton property was complete, its dark history erased by fresh paint and new fencing, and the sounds of animals who would never again know neglect or cruelty. The sanctuary's first residents, a group of horses rescued from a situation similar to what his own foals had endured, grazed peacefully in pastures that had once been sites of suffering. Jake had been asked to speak at the ceremony, an invitation he had initially declined before allowing himself to be persuaded by Dr. Chen and Deputy Webb, who insisted that his words would mean more to the community than anything the politicians and dignitaries could offer. Standing at the podium now, looking out at the faces of neighbors and strangers united by a common cause, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "A year ago," he began, his voice rough with emotion he did not try to hide, "I was just a rancher checking his fence line. I wasn't looking to be a hero or start a movement or change anything about this community. I was just doing what needed to be done, the same way my father taught me, the same way his father taught him. Take care of your land, take care of your animals, and mind your own affairs." He paused, gathering his thoughts, remembering the smell of that barn and the eyes of the smallest foal looking up at him from the corner where she lay dying. But sometimes minding your own affairs isn't enough. Sometimes you stumble onto something so wrong, so terrible, that staying silent becomes its own kind of crime. Those 8 foals I found that morning, they couldn't speak for themselves. They couldn't call for help or file a complaint or hire a lawyer. All they could do was suffer and wait for someone to notice them. The crowd had gone silent, every face turned toward him with an attention that would have made Jake uncomfortable under normal circumstances. But this was not about him, not really. It was about what they had all learned together over the past 12 months. We learned a lot of hard lessons this year. We learned that evil can wear a friendly face, that people we trust can betray us in ways we never imagined. We learned that looking the other way has consequences, that our silence can enable suffering we never intended to allow. Those are painful lessons, and I know many of you are still struggling with them. Jake looked toward the pasture where the sanctuary's first rescues were grazing, their coats shining in the autumn sun, their bodies strong and healthy. But we also learned something else. We learned that this community has a heart, that when we see something wrong, we can come together to make it right. We learned that healing is possible, for animals and for people. We learned that second chances are real, that broken things can be mended, that hope is not just a word, but a force that can transform the world if we let it. He stepped back from the podium, his part in the ceremony complete. The applause that followed was generous, but Jake barely heard it, his attention already turning toward home and the 8 horses who waited for him there. The drive back to his ranch took him past the site where his life had changed, the barn now demolished and replaced by a memorial garden where visitors could reflect on what had happened and recommit themselves to preventing such cruelty in the future. Jake slowed his truck as he passed, offering a silent acknowledgement to the place where tragedy and redemption had intersected so unexpectedly. His horses greeted him at the gate, 8 strong bodies pressing forward with the enthusiasm of creatures who had learned to associate his presence with safety and comfort and love. Hope was at the front as always, her mahogany coat gleaming, her eyes bright with intelligence and trust. Behind her came Storm, no longer hanging back but pushing forward with a confidence that still amazed Jake every time he witnessed it. Ghost nickered a greeting, his voice strong and clear now, the silence of his trauma long since broken. The twins jostled for position while Dusty tried to make peace between them. Copper and Shadow stood together as they always did, their unlikely friendship having deepened into something unshakable. Jake walked among them, touching each one, speaking their names, feeling the miracle of their survival in the warmth of their bodies and the strength of their spirits. They had been locked in darkness, abandoned to die, forgotten by the world. And now they stood in sunshine, healthy and happy and whole, proof that cruelty did not have to be the end of the story. He thought about Martha, about how she would have loved these horses, about the conversations they would have had watching them grow and heal. The grief he had carried for so long had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something he could bear, a presence rather than an absence, a connection rather than a loss. She was still with him in some way he could not explain, her love woven into the fabric of everything he did. The sun was setting over Cedar Creek County, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reflected off the coats of his horses and the surface of the pond where they drank. Jake leaned against the fence, surrounded by the herd he had saved, and felt something he had not felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of pain or the forgetting of loss, but the acceptance of both alongside the recognition that life continued to offer beauty and meaning and purpose to those willing to receive them. 8 foals had been locked in that barn, starving and forgotten. 8 horses now grazed in his pasture, strong and loved and free. The journey between those two realities had changed everything about Jake's life, had shown him that the worst moments could become the foundation for the best ones, that healing was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference in a world that desperately needed compassion. But tonight, Jake Hollister stood with his horses in the fading light and knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Thank you for following this story. I hope it moved you. If it did, consider subscribing for more stories like this one. And remember, sometimes the greatest transformations begin with simply noticing what others have chosen to ignore.